afternoon. My name's Tim McGurthy. I'm Executive Director of the Worcester Regional Research Bureau. I'm proud to be here to represent the Research Bureau. We're an independent research and analysis organization of public policy to promote informed public debate and decision-making. And that's why we bring together forums like this. Here to bring greetings from Worcester Technical High School is Interim Principal Kyle Brennan.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome. I want to thank the Research Bureau for holding these discussions on these important topics, Common Core and school financing and the other topics they cover. I also want to welcome our guests and our moderator, Dr. Boone and Commissioner Chester and Professor Bisk and Phyllis Goldstein, our English liaison for the Worcester Public Schools. And I want to welcome you to Worcester Technical High School, a 2013 United States Department of Education Blue Ribbon School. If you haven't been up here, I welcome you back to partake in some of the public services that we have here. We have 1,400 students, 23 technical programs, and the school is open to the public. As you can see from our main street out here during school hours, I welcome you back to, attend the Skyline Bistro for lunch or stop in the cafe for some baked goods, get your hair done, have your car detailed or serviced, any number of the services up here. So again, welcome, and we'll let Tim back on. Thank you.
And for those who are worried, I did not get my hair done here, so you can look to the students for a far better job. The Research Bureau engaged educational standards and testing in spring of this year with our report Toward a Common Understanding of the Common Core. What we found was a troubling array of misunderstanding and misinformation. We hope that our report helped to provide a factual basis to lay out a framework for discussion of the initiative. Now, we're pleased to bring together the experts, both policymakers and practitioners, to discuss the pros, cons, and future of education standards and testing in Massachusetts. I want to thank our sponsors, Commerce Bank and Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, as well as St. Gobain and the Hanover Insurance Group. Without those sponsors, we couldn't hold forums like this and bring people together to talk about the issues. I also want to thank the Telegram and Gazette, which is our media sponsor for today's event. For more on our sponsors and our support, please see our website, wrrb.org. This forum is part of the Francis Harrington Forums on Municipal Government. They are free and open to the public, and as mentioned, it's an opportunity to hear from the experts on critical topics affecting Greater Worcester. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for the event, Melinda Boone. Dr. Boone was appointed superintendent for the Worcester Public Schools in July 2009, a district with over 23,000 students and 44 schools. The third largest district in the state, although as pointed out recently, may be overcoming to become number 2. We'll see. Prior to her work in Worcester, Dr. Boone served as Chief Academic Officer for the Norfolk Public Schools in Norfolk, Virginia. She's worked as a speech and language pathologist for Suffolk Public Schools in Suffolk, Virginia, Director of Special Education Pupil Services for Franklin City Public Schools in Franklin, Virginia, Coordinator of Public Personnel and Testing for Suffolk Public Schools, and Assistant Superintendent for Educational Services with the Isle of Wight County Public Schools in Virginia. Dr. Boone holds a BA in Communication Disorders with a pre-med emphasis from Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, a Master of Arts in Audiology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a Certificate of Advanced Studies from Old Dominion University, and a Doctorate in Education from our joint alma mater, the College of William & Mary. Dr. Boone is a 2004 Fellow of the Broad Urban Superintendent's Academy, and she was a 2012 Erskine Award recipient. So with that, Dr. Boone.
Good afternoon. I certainly consider it a privilege to be able to moderate the forum today and share the panel with such a distinguished group of individuals. Part of my opening responsibilities to discuss where Worcester is in relation to the standards, how we've approached the revised standards, how we've aligned our systems of support and planning for curriculum work, and where we go in the future in our progress. I certainly want to thank the Research Bureau for addressing this topic in a manner which it did of putting out what are the facts. It's very easy not to like change and then inflame it with things that just aren't factually true. I've seen documents that say with the Common Core, we'll teach children 4 times 3 equals 11. There's no standard that does that, and yet that's some of the rhetoric that's there. One of the things that's very clear is this nation has moved into a different level of accountability for education, and rightfully so. Communities should expect a return on their investment, and our families should expect that our children are going to be extremely successful at having matriculated through our public schools, pre-K and kindergarten through 12th grade, and into college and careers. So that should be a clear understanding. But how do we measure that level of accountability unless we have a playing field that is defined across the board, and thus we have standards across this nation? And it doesn't matter what's happening in the political realm. I think one thing is very sure. Processes may be adjusted and changed, but movement away from standards as an accountability system for education will not happen. This country is not going to go back to the wild, wild west days of education, that anything happens, anything goes, and therefore what we're saying is good enough. Those days are gone. And so within Worcester, how do we address these issues? Obviously, Massachusetts has had standards for quite some time, and they have standards that have been recognized nationally as some of the most rigorous in this nation. As we think about standards, nothing stays the same. We have a responsibility to review and revise those standards as appropriate. And I'm quite sure Commissioner Chester will talk a little bit about that process. But as a district, where 2/3 of our funding is state-driven, and participation in federal programs is aligned with our participation in the state standards, the option to not participate is not an option. Before my time in Massachusetts, I've read the articles and heard the stories of how difficult it was to transition into MCAS and the idea of standards. That's not different from most states across this country. But what we know is that the standards created an opportunity to define our progress. Any standard is not set in stone forever. We should review and revise with what we know is cutting-edge knowledge, the content shifts, the research that has been done in the various content areas within those standards. And so we find ourselves in Massachusetts with a recent revision to the standards. And what does that mean for us? Let me be perfectly clear. As a superintendent, whether Massachusetts revised the standards that incorporate the Common Core, or whether Massachusetts revised its standards outside of that window, the revision to the standards would have happened. And as a district, we have a need to be responsive to those standards. The second myth that I want to be very clear about dispelling is standards for the state do not represent the curriculum. Standards represent what we expect our students to know and be able to demonstrate mastery and success in across the various grade levels. Standards do not represent how we will teach, but they represent what we need to make sure we cover. And nor do standards represent every single aspect of what we could see happening in education in a classroom. But they certainly represent a very strong foundation for what's there. And so when Massachusetts revised its standards and reflected on the Common Core standards, the nationally driven standards for this work, they said, let's do an analysis of where Massachusetts nationally recognized strong standards and what's reflected with the standards of the Common Core. We know that a large percentage of the Common Core standards were reflective in the standards that Massachusetts already had in place. And that being the case, there was no lowering of expectations. However, for that percentage of the standards that were not reflected in the Massachusetts standard, that became a real conversation around what's the value added aspect of that work. As a district, we have a responsibility to align our curriculum with the standards, the scope, the sequence, the pacing, how we will approach and chunk the information for the most appropriate instructional delivery. Be very clear, I'm a superintendent who does not believe in scripted education. So you will find our students in the same areas, approaching the same aspects of the curriculum in the same period of time. But you can go to 3 or 4 different schools and they won't be on the same page, nor will the activities that they engage in be the same. One of the things we've heard over and over again about standards is that they take away a teacher's ability to be creative and teach. Nowhere is it written in any standards how you teach. It addresses what should be taught as part of your curriculum. A district derives its curriculum from the standards. One of the things that I've implemented since I've been here as superintendent is a curriculum renewal cycle. We did not have that in Worcester. We did not have a systemic way of taking standards, unpacking them for meaning, and aligning them in a way that a teacher could use that for planning his or her instruction. And that's what we've been successful in doing, and constantly reviewing and revising our curriculum on an annual basis to make sure, based on our data, how successful are we with the alignment and how do we go forward. That's how a district uses standards. We unpack them for meaning, for teachers, for creating the alignment around resources, around formative and summative assessments. We use all of this to be able to communicate with our students and with our parents exactly what their children will be learning during a period of time and how we will monitor their progress towards that. With the MCAS standard, so let me step back before one other comment, is that our curriculum offers exemplars and model lessons for teachers to use for planning. We do not script the lessons. There's not a one-size-fits-all model lesson. We draw upon the expertise and the training and the experience of teachers to plan rigorous and engaging lessons for their classrooms, and so that our children can lead with the depth and breadth of the standard they're being instructed in. With MCAS, the original MCAS, the state, engaged in an assessment system that says, how will we know we're doing well in that accountability aspect? As for Worcester, we have participated in the MCAS assessment. Participation in the state assessment is not optional. It is expected. We certainly have expectations for our high school students to graduate, that they must have taken and passed MCAS tests in English language arts, mathematics, and biology. It's very clear that that's an expectation. At the elementary level, we begin with our grades 3 and 4 and moving forward of grades and participating in the MCAS in English language arts, science, engineering, and technology. The purpose for these assessments, again, to understand how well as a school, as a district, as the state, that our students are doing in relation to that set of standards. A lot has been written and said about who makes money off an assessment system. Well, ladies and gentlemen, when we go in for heart surgery and there's a bypass machine that's used in that surgery to support both the breathing and the blood management of blood flow during that surgery, have we ever questioned who created that tool, that machine to support that surgery? Same thing happens in testing and assessment. There's a specialization. That's a very specialized field. It doesn't mean as a state we accept whatever is out there, but it means we design a platform and a blueprint. Someone has to design that. Someone has to help make sense out of that. And so that's what happens with a state assessment system, not just in Massachusetts. You know, we hear a lot about who's going to make money if the state assessment changes. Well, someone is being contracted now to develop the state assessment that we've had in place for any number of years. As a district, we look to those MCAS scores to help us look at individual student progress, a school's progress, to help us make sense out of the revisions and review that we do of our curriculum. And at the end of the day, it becomes our report card of how well we're making progress. It is a snapshot in time, so it doesn't represent everything that we have in place to monitor our progress. With new standards, revised standards, obviously, we would be comparing apples and oranges if we didn't align an assessment system to match the new standards. And thus we find ourselves at that crossroads that as the standards have been revised, how do we look at the opportunities to measure our progress? Worcester is one of 3 districts in the Commonwealth, because of our size, that we had an option to choose all MCAS for the 2014-15 school year, to choose all PARC, which is one of the national assessments that is in development, or to do a hybrid of both. We presented and worked with all of our principals and listened to the voices from the field around thinking about what would happen and what selection should we make. That selection was also driven by the fact that whether it's PARC or whether it's the next generation of MCAS, the assessments that we're currently using will change based on the fact that the standards have changed. And so when we worked with our principals in schools, we submitted a proposal to the school committee that resulted in just about half of our schools selecting the PARC assessment and about half choosing MCAS. Because the graduation requirements are still in place, our high schools predominantly can exercise PARC if they want to try out the algebra standards. But otherwise, we're moving forward. And so the one thing that we know is the constant in education is that change will happen. But I posit by saying today that it's not change just for change's sake. It is change to move our education into a realm of global competitiveness and to make sure that our children will be college and career ready and continue to advance success for this nation. So thank you for your attendance today, and we're looking forward to hearing from our panelists. Okay, our first panelist I'm pleased to introduce is Commissioner Mitchell Chester.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. I always enjoy coming to Worcester. You're doing some outstanding things. We're in an outstanding institution right here, so I don't know if Kyle's still in the room or not. Kyle, who's taken over this institution, and you've got a tremendous superintendent. I am a big fan of Melinda Boone's doing a great job with education in Worcester and making sure that you're building on what you've done over the years here, but not being complacent and continuing to move the ball forward. So I want to call you out, Melinda. I'm going to speak briefly because it'd be great if we can get to some questions and answers and see where your concerns are. I want to thank Tim and the Worcester Research Bureau for sponsoring this. When I got to Massachusetts in 2008, when I started as your commissioner, we were just beginning the process in Massachusetts of rethinking our expectations in English language arts and mathematics. And this is pretty common practice. States develop what we call standards. Sometimes they're called curriculum frameworks. They're a statement about what does it mean for a young person to be literate, to know their math, and what does it mean by the time they graduate? What would we expect them to be able to do? What would we expect them to know, and what would we expect them to be able to do with what they know? And backing up from graduation, what would we expect at each grade level? By the time they leave middle school and enter high school, by the time they leave elementary school and enter middle school. And that's those statements about what we expect young people to know and be able to do are what we call standards or curriculum frameworks. And every 6, 7, 8 years, typically a state will rethink them. We'll say, do we have it right? It's been 8 years since we last looked at these. Is it time to refine them, to upgrade them, and so forth? And so we were just beginning that process in 2008, and this multi-state effort got underway called the Common Core Standard Effort. And the notion of Common Core came from governors and my counterparts in other states. And it came out of a report that was done in 2007 by the National Governors Association, a bipartisan group of governors and what were called chief state school officers, the top state officials for education, said it makes no sense in the 21st century for 50 states to each have their own separate definition of what it means to be literate, to know how to read and write, and what it means to know your math. It's not as though the math you have to learn in Massachusetts is usually different than the math you have to learn in California. Or it's not as though learning to read and write means something different in Massachusetts than it does in Florida. And so the governors and the chief state school officers collectively called for the development of a common core of understanding what it means to be literate and what it means to know math, because we had a system in the United States, and we still do. I mean, we're sort of on the verge of transitioning out, where 50 different states had 50 different definitions of what it meant to be literate, what it means to know your math, and had 50 different tests and 50 different standards for what it means to be up to speed in math and in reading and in writing. And the governors said, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We're an incredibly mobile society. It's rarer and rarer that the opportunities that young people coming through our schools experience are limited to where they grew up in today's world. And it's makes not a lot of sense to limit ourselves to just what's happening in the United States. If we're going to be competitive as a nation, we better pay attention to what the most aspirational nations in the world are aiming toward. And that was the birth of the Common Core State Standards movement. Came from states, came from governors, came from Republican and Democratic governors, came from my counterparts across the nation. And it is played forward with a lot of effort in Massachusetts, and Tom Fortman is here. Tom was on the state board at the time, and I think, Tom will speak for himself, but I think kind of skeptical at first, right? I mean, because we were Massachusetts, and we were widely recognized as having the strongest, if not the strongest, one of the strongest sets of standards and assessments in the nation. But we had already said to ourselves, we need to upgrade them. We were planning to do that anyways. And so we watched and we actively participated in the development of the Common Core standards, and ultimately the State Board of Education voted to incorporate the Common Core state standards in our new standards. They were new in 2010. 4 years ago, we adopted these. And as Superintendent Boone said, we augmented them with Massachusetts-specific elements. We're now in the process of looking at a next generation assessment. You've heard it called the PARCC, P-A-R-C-C. Our MCAS test that we will give in a couple of months is in its 18th year. 18th year of administration. We added some grades. We added one subject. We added science, technology, engineering. But it basically has not been upgraded in 18 years. And we've learned a lot about learning progressions, about what it takes to be literate in the 21st century, what it takes to know your math. And so the PARCC assessment that we're one of a dozen states that's trying out, giving it a test drive, is an assessment that's designed to be this next generation assessment. That if it proves itself, and the proof will be in the pudding, and students across the Commonwealth are trying it out this spring, this coming spring. A bunch of kids, 80,000 students tried it out this past spring. And depending on the feedback we get, how the two tests match up, assuming that Park is in fact a stronger assessment, doesn't lower our standard, in fact raises it if anything, because we're not going to let it slip backward in terms of our expectation. But we are trying that out, and that could become our next test, our next assessment, next version of the MCAS, if you will. So that's, you know, very brief overview of this topic. I don't know what you've been hearing. I'd love to get your questions, because there's a lot of information and there's a lot of misinformation that's floating around about this topic. And so I hope that we'll have a chance to dig into this in the areas that you have questions about. But again, I appreciate the opportunity from the Worcester Research Bureau to be able to be part of this discussion. And Superintendent, who's up next? You're going to take it. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I was so excited about my remarks that I failed to turn over my page and properly introduce the Commissioner. As he indicated, he's been Commissioner since 2008.
Skip that.
But he has an impressive background in terms of working in Ohio, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania as leading the work around curriculum instruction and assessment. It's indeed my privilege to introduce now Richard Bisk, who is Professor of Mathematics at Worcester State University. Gentlemen, we've worked with for a long time in the field of mathematics. He's done a lot with the Singapore math and supports us a great deal with professional development, not just in Worcester, but across the nation. Professor Bisk.
And is there a little clicker, or I can just use? And is the mic close enough? No. Okay. I didn't think so. So let's see if this works. That better? Close enough? Okay. So I didn't want her to introduce me because I figured I'd introduce myself, and I've also noticed that I'm probably going to repeat a good deal of what you've already heard, but perhaps from my perspective. So the first thing, this is the part that scares me, which is that I've been doing this for 35 years. But it does mean I have some sense of what college students in the US can do or can't do in mathematics. For quite a while, not quite as long, I've been doing PD work with teachers and a lot of work with K-12 students, so I have some sense of what goes on in K-12 classrooms. And as Dr. Boone mentioned, I do a lot of work with math textbooks from Singapore. Singapore typically scores at the top in mathematics or near the top in international studies of math performance. So I have some sense of what world-class mathematics looks like. And I don't think the DNA of kids in Singapore is any different than DNA of kids here. So I suspect our kids are capable of the same level of work. So Common Core math, thank you. Better? Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd say it's about time. Much of what I've read about in the media, it's almost as the people who write the articles haven't actually read the Common Core. And so if you have a question about what's in the Common Core, it's easy to find. There's the website. I'm sure if you go and do a web search, if you get the website, you can find it. So let me just maybe briefly say from my viewpoint what the Common Core is and what it isn't. And again, I may be repeating what you've heard already. It's not a curriculum. It's not a pedagogy. It's not a test, either for assessing students or for assessing teachers. It doesn't tell teachers how to run their classrooms. I think Dr. Boone said all of these, and perhaps Dr. Chester also said all of these. And it's not a federal mandate. What is it? And again, you heard this. It essentially is a list of what students should learn in mathematics at each grade level. And it's an initiative of the states, as that was, and that was mentioned before too. It sets a much higher bar than we've had in the past. It emphasizes in mathematics both understanding and fluency. And in the land of mathematics, we've had these battles going on for 20 or 30 years about whether fluency is more important or conceptual understanding is more important. The Common Core says they're both important, and you need them both. And essentially, if you look at the mathematics, it's the same mathematics I learned 40 or 50 years ago. The big difference is there's an expectation that students actually will understand the mathematics. That if you ask a student, why do you divide fractions the way you do? Well, you're supposed to flip and multiply. That's not a reason. Why do you add and subtract signed numbers the way you do? Well, if it's two negative, it's a positive. Wait, unless you're adding them, and then it's a negative. But why? Well, we're supposed to teach the why. And the students who learn the why learn that mathematics is a coherent whole and not a mindless sequence of rules and regulations that you learn and you spit back on an exam. So why was it developed? And again, you've heard some of this already. Student performance in international studies. Our students are essentially not prepared to compete mathematically. If I look at my classroom, the strongest students I have are often first-generation immigrants. The most diverse classroom I have is my calculus classroom. The least diverse classrooms I have are my classrooms in math classes that are below the level of calculus. Too many of our students, and this is not my school, it's universities throughout the country, need remedial work. And even if you look at the courses that are not considered remedial, we all offer courses like college algebra. College algebra is high school algebra taught in college. After that, after college algebra, we all teach a course called pre-calculus, which is also the name of a high school course. About the only difference is we teach it in one semester rather than a year. Same math topics. Inconsistency in expectations between states. And this, of course, was mentioned before too, but I'll give you a great example. This shows you, this is a study done in 2006, and it shows you the grade level based upon state documents of their own standards about when the concept of addition and subtraction of fractions should be introduced. You notice the vast majority of the states, or about half the states, say fourth grade. Some say fifth grade. Some say third grade. Some say first grade. Some say seventh grade. This is one reason the U.S. military is a strong supporter of the Common Core. The children of people in the military move around a lot. And they recognize that if a child starts school in Kansas and then goes to Connecticut and goes to Texas, they could be studying the same topic 3 years in a row, or they could be skipping some topics. Whoops. So the word Common Core has a meaning. It's the core we should all have in common. Somehow in the media, Common Core has been expressed as this dirty word that we should throw things at. It just means the core all students should have in common. So some places will say, I was on the radio with right after a congressman in Ohio where they're trying to repeal Common Core. I suspect they'll try to repeal gravity next. But each state is like, we're doing the best. Well, everybody says, everybody thinks they're doing the best. Our old standards were the best in the country. I believe they were the best in the country, if not among the best. But somehow, despite that, we had huge numbers of students who needed remedial work. What they were missing is a certain level of focus and coherence that you see in the top performing countries that we were missing. So briefly, what I see is some of the challenges. And I have a list of 4, and I'll go through them pretty quickly. Test scores will go down. People will get upset. Well, you raise standards, test scores will go down. And so in the process of changing our tests, we have to make sure that we're careful about how test scores are used. Because if they're not used properly, people will rebel. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't introduce new tests, but I think care needs to be taken. Parents think the math is different. Well, it is in one way, from what many of them saw when they were students. There's an expectation their students actually understand the math. So I've seen things like 10 worst Common Core problems. I think there was somewhere online I ran into this, and 5 or 6 of them were actually good problems, but the person reading them had no understanding of why they were important. You know, it might seem obvious that 10 ones makes a 10. Not if you're 5 years old. In the same way that long and short vowels are not obvious when you're 5 years old. So a lot of time needs to be spent on communication with parents so they understand why things are being done differently and why it's important to talk about trading 10s for 1s rather than borrowing and carrying, that we're emphasizing a type of conceptual understanding that they haven't seen before. One of the biggest challenges I think we face is teacher preparation, because in mathematics we've often taken the view that it's just elementary school mathematics, what's the big deal? And so as a nation, we haven't prepared our teachers in the same way that a lot of other nations have. So effectively, most of our K teachers do not have the depth of understanding they need to teach the Common Core well. And I say this with no criticism of them. It's really a system that has not properly prepared them. Most of them want that understanding and want that opportunity. And this is a chance for me to brag about my state, because we instituted the most rigorous standards in the country in mathematics for our new elementary school teachers. But there are 49 other states. There are teachers who became certified before those certification requirements came into effect. So work needs to be done with our teachers, and they need our support. You can't simply say, teach something that's more challenging without giving them the background to do it. And the last challenge, which I made reference to before, which I would call politics and outright lies, unfortunately, Common Core has become a political football. And if you see a claim about the Common Core, don't take it on face value. And I'll leave you with a quote. Anybody know what that one's from? Close, Lenin. I've seen the same mistruths stated over and over about the Common Core. One of my favorite ones comes from one of the writers of the Common Core. He said, he was asked, are these standards too rigorous? And he says, no, they're no more rigorous than the top performing countries. And that got taken as saying, well, they're less rigorous than the top performing countries. Those are two different statements. And so again, if somebody makes a claim about the Common Core, I would encourage you to read it. So thanks for your attention.
Certainly, we want to thank Professor Bisk for his view into the standards. Our next presenter, and I have a couple of tied together comments that I'll make before we get into discussion, so I'll hold a couple of my thoughts. But our next panelist and presenter is Phyllis Goldstein, who serves as the English Language Arts Curriculum Liaison pre-K through 12 for Worcester Public Schools. Significant in Phyllis's background and experience is that she served with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education on both the development of the 2001 English Language Arts Framework and the revision committee for the 2011 English Language Arts and Literacy Framework. Phyllis then brings to this conversation a very unique perspective and one that sees it from the ground up in terms of the process. So Phyllis, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Boone, and thank you all for being here. As Dr. Boone mentioned, my perspective is a very personal one, and I'd like to tell you that story because that's what English teachers do, don't they? And that's what I am. I've been to several, just to reference what has already been said by the panelists, I've been to several meetings, many meetings, as a matter of fact, in which the process of the adoption of the Common Core has been questioned and maligned. And because I've experienced the process personally from my position in Worcester, I'd like to tell you about it from my point of view. I had been in the Worcester Public Schools for just a few years, having come from Pennsylvania from teaching and from the private sector. And in 1999, I was asked, along with many other high school teachers in Worcester by the DOE, to get together with other high school teachers in our district and discuss what should be taught in grades 9 through 12. I was vaguely aware that this conversation was probably happening in other communities. I thought that middle school and elementary school teachers were having the conversation, but we talked about it very earnestly in isolation. Our recommendations went to the state, and a very good step forward was the 2001 English Language Arts framework. It was a good step forward because we hadn't seen something like that before. But it had gaps, it had repetitions in it. And when I was asked in 2009 to again be part of a process, I was delighted about how different this process was. We began as a state committee. I, along with other educators from pre-K through college, with writing specialists, reading specialists, specialists in English language learning, librarians, and a lot of other types of experts in education met together, and we studied, as has been referenced, we studied other state frameworks, we studied other country frameworks, we studied formatting. We wanted to make this a very supportive process for teachers. And we finished our work in about 18 months, and we sent it off with our representative who represented our state in the Common Core State Standards discussion. And when I saw the Common Core State Standards, I really recognized our work. I felt that our Massachusetts work had become one of the backbones of this national work with other states. In addition, I was part of the revision committee. Sometimes you hear that this is whitewashing literature, that this doesn't represent what we value in Massachusetts, the Common Core State Standards. We added 15% of what we felt were the Massachusetts priorities. And that included an entire pre-K standards. It included more emphasis on literature and more opportunities for creative writing. And that is part of our Massachusetts standards. So the Common Core is now incorporated in the Massachusetts ELA and literacy framework. Now, the teachers then had a very strong framework to work with. No gaps, no revisions, because we didn't work in isolation as high school teachers, elementary school teachers. We worked in our strands. I had particular expertise in the teaching of writing, so I worked in the writing strand from pre-K through college. There were no gaps anymore. It was a much, much stronger representation of what we needed to teach. And you'll see that in a moment. I'm forgetting totally about my slides. So what did we do with the framework when it came to our district? Well, I, along with my colleagues, began to meet with principals, literacy coaches, teacher groups, and we unpacked the grade level standards. I held curriculum renewal sessions to which parents were invited and parents came. I made several reports to the Teaching and Learning Subcommittee of the Worcester School Committee. We involved teachers, the community, our stakeholders in every step of the way in introducing them to the standards from the frameworks. In 2012, this curriculum renewal project that Dr. Boone referenced really took off. At that point, I worked with 60 teachers through a series of days where we really did research what was current, what would be the most current way to create a strong curriculum for our district. First, we studied Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe's Understanding by Design, and their template led us to develop curriculum maps for every grade, pre-K, I'm talking about English language arts, but the same is true for math, pre-K through grade 12. And these are some of the elements that you see on the slides for the curriculum maps. And I'll refer to these later. I'm going to just show you a sample of one of the maps that we created. But we have transfer goals that students need to know as they move forward in the grades. The standards in each map, the essential questions to engage students, the knowledge that students need to have independently, the skills and suggestions that we've put in for their assessments. Again, we're not telling teachers how to teach, but we're asking for some consistency in their teaching. The English language arts standards are divided into these strands. And I wasn't sure how much you knew about this, so I just want to mention this to you. We have the reading strand, the writing, speaking and listening, and language. And I want to stop for a moment and just mention the reading, because there's been a lot of talk. One of the misconceptions that keeps going on and on is about that we will no longer teach literature. Literature is gone. We're going to be teaching technical manuals. That I actually heard on the radio, technical manuals. No, that's not true. I'm an English teacher. I love my literature. We have a strong Massachusetts heritage in literature, and literature is a part of our standards. But we recognized that there wasn't enough reading going on, and there wasn't enough complex text and struggling with text and close reading. And we need to have more reading across the curriculum. So while English teaches, yes, literature, and yes, some informational text, and I'll give you an example in a moment, we want science, social studies, history, the technical subjects, to also have more reading. And that's why we have the English language arts / literacy frameworks, because for the first time, through the Common Core, through their research, we have literacy standards that now ask for reading standards and writing standards in the other subjects. I think that's a great step forward. Just my example, just to show you how we share the information and the literature. Recently, I did some 10th grade professional development with my social studies colleague. And whereas in 10th grade, the English teachers, some English teachers, teach To Kill a Mockingbird, an important book, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. And we thought in history, we could deepen students' knowledge, deepen it greatly, and get them to be critical thinkers by having them have the context of a letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King. What an argument. What a superb rhetorical use of strategy. So I could use it too to teach argument. History could use it to teach context and deepen the knowledge of the literature that the English teachers would be teaching through To Kill a Mockingbird. That's the kind of sharing and balance that we're talking about. Forgot the slide. There's the slide for that. So reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language, where we talk about vocabulary and the conventions of English. I love this slide. I've borrowed it. It shows the staircase of complexity. This shows how you can start with a standard, a college readiness standard, college and career, of how to write a good argument, and how that can start on the bottom step of pre-K. That's a standard that in pre-K, students learn to express an opinion that they would dictate and a teacher would write down. By the time they would get to first grade, when they could write, they would learn to state the issue, what's their opinion, and a concluding sentence. As they go up through second grade, they learn to use transitions, and so on and so forth, until they're writing counter-arguments, using evidence, explaining their evidence, analyzing, until they're college and career ready. Of course, as Dr. Bisk mentioned, there are some changes that teachers are aware of because of this more rigorous education. They have to balance the informational and literary texts. They have to build knowledge in the disciplines through texts. And that's the instructional methods. Okay. Provide opportunities for students to engage in text-based discussions and reflection. Write from sources to inform or make an argument, and build academic vocabulary. Academic vocabulary that they can use as they continue the staircase into more and more complex texts, so they can understand the texts and use these words in their writing. I referenced that I'd show you a sample map. These are completely teacher-driven. Teachers in groups are writing these. We're sharing these. This is grade 5. I just chose grade 5. Unit 1, 5 weeks is a suggested time. Nobody's coming in the door and saying you're at week 6. This is classroom-driven. But here are the transfer goals that I mentioned. And then we have the standards that we'd use for this. Now, this particular map that we've worked with teachers has to deal with a lot of getting to know each other and speaking and listening, and also writing a real narrative, a narrative using dialogue. In 5th grade, they'd be using strategies like dialogue, characterization, description. By the way, there are approximately 70 of those maps already created, grades pre-K through 12. But just to address that, this is driven by Worcester Public School teachers. These are the maps created by Worcester Public School teachers. Okay? We have essential questions. It's very important to engage all the students. So I love the second question here that the teachers created to engage the students. How can learning about authors help us understand the choices that they make as writers? So the reading and writing connection, they will understand that as they read different authors, maybe I can make that choice. Maybe I can write a rhetorical question. Okay, and also as part of the template that we're creating, these are the knowledge, the facts that students will know independently when they finish the unit. These are the skills, the discrete skills and processes students should be able to demonstrate and use independently at the end of each unit. And finally, what we're creating now are suggestions for assessments for acquisition. So we are aware of a wide variety of learning methods of our students, And so we've created an array of assessments. Some are speaking assessments, speaking and listening, for instance, Socratic seminars. Some are reflections in journals using texts, and some are performance-based assessments, such as essays or writing letters to editors, real-life writing that students may want to do. I believe very strongly that our goal is achievable. And this is our goal: to support all teachers in the implementation of the English Language Arts Literacy Framework so that all of Worcester Public School students will be college and career ready by the end of high school. And I emphasize that word all because I think that that is what is possible with our new framework. How are we doing it? This is my last slide. This is how we're achieving this goal. We are doing a lot of curriculum planning. Everything is teacher-based. Teachers are invited to these groups, and there are many types of groups. There are grade-level groups. There are instructional learning groups. There are secondary department head groups. There are curriculum renewal groups. We bring these groups together, we discuss things. It's all teacher-led. We use a lot of professional development in the area of instruction. There's a lot of models that we use for teachers and for students, writing models. And we also use a lot of sample items so that we can look at what the testing looks like and say, the testing is testing the standards. Are we teaching to the standards? Can we align to the standards? If we teach to the standards, all of our students will be successful. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
I want to thank each of the panelists for their insight and sharing very different perspectives, and yet we find ourselves at a similar crossroads in terms of the rigor and the strength of the standards, how these are being utilized. We have a few minutes for questions and comments, and if I do this well, we won't feel like we're driving through Kelly Square. Okay? So, an intersection with no rhyme or reason. I will ask each for questions to limit your background. Let's get to the question. Each person one question, and if we have time, we'll go back through so that multiple voices can get their questions into the forum. Okay, so I saw Ms. Glorio's hand.
Thank you, Dr. Boone. Thank you for having this forum. I have a two-part question, which could be said as a one question. Dr. Boone, you said that the standards are not curriculum, but the commission has said on Fox News just recently that the PARCC test is a test worth teaching to. So how can these standards, why are these standards not, so how can you say the standards are not curriculum? Now, Commissioner Chester, you also said that our consortium started with 23 states. Now the consortium is down to 12. Why do you think 11 states jumped ship?
I'll assume by the direction of that question, you want Commissioner Chester to respond.
Yeah, no. So to the issue of standards versus curriculum, even if you wanted to decide what to teach tomorrow morning in your 4th grade English class or your 8th grade math class, standards wouldn't help you, right? Because they're not going to give you a lesson. They're not going to tell you how to teach. They're not going to tell you which book to use. So when I say a test worth teaching to, it's because it expects kids to think. It expects kids to be able to look at multiple perspectives on the same topic and understand and compare and contrast those perspectives. It expects them not only to know their math, but to be able to use their math to solve problems. That's what the standard will show you. Somebody used the analogy, and I always apologize in advance for using a sports analogy because I know that it may or may not resonate with everybody, but it's sort of like if the National Football League let every team decide what the dimensions of the field were and how many yards it took to get a first down, right? They don't. They have standards for the length of the field, how many yards to a first down, but they don't tell each team how you get that first down, right? How the plays you design and so forth are very much by each team. There's a lot of politics around the Common Core. There's vicious politics, and it's crept into all kinds of governors' races and governors who were absolute supporters as the support for the standards eroded in their states. You saw them completely change their position on those standards. So you have a lot of states that have, in one way or another, tried to distance themselves from the standards and the assessments. Very few have actually changed them. Some have changed the name of them. Some have called for study commissions and so forth. But that's a process that's taken place over the last couple of years.
And my portion of the response, we'll hold follow-ups, one question so we can get multiple voices in the room. We'll come back around if there's time for follow-ups. But in terms of my response as it relates to curriculum versus standards, if you ever look at the standard, and both Richard and Phyllis had great examples of a very broadly stated, very broad statement. In order to create curriculum, you have to unpack that statement. That's the overarching goal. You have to unpack that statement, and that's what becomes the curriculum. What are the incremental steps? What are the aspects of the work that you need to instruct in? And that makes a very clear distinction between the standard itself and what's expected, which becomes the curriculum. Districts across this country that are successful are those that have strong written and aligned curriculum with the standards so that you get that staircase effect that Phyllis mentioned. One of the things, having the opportunity as a commissioner and others to work in other states, as strong as I viewed the standards when I arrived, I was challenged by the fact that there was no scaffolding, no staircasing, no building of expectations. And so if you were expected to look at functions and patterns in algebra, that would be the same statement in kindergarten as it would be in an algebra class in 10th grade. Well, we begin thinking about patterns, functions in algebra, but in pre-K and kindergarten, it begins with a sorting mechanism. How do we teach grouping and sorting? That's a prerequisite algebraic skill as we begin to build, and that's what we didn't have in Massachusetts. We had the global standards. Next question, please. Sir, you had a question earlier.
Yes, I was trying to fit all this together in Common Core, but I'll set that aside. A comment for you both. Teachers, friends of mine, who I regard highly, 10 to 15 years teaching, have recently told me they're thinking about leaving the profession. They said that they feel like they're becoming exam proctors and test preparers, and the joy of teaching isn't there anymore. Is that a concern that you can relate to? Or do you think that's...
I don't know if I need this. How's my teacher voice?
Kind of, we're asking, you can use that.
I think that teaching in this dynamic age is hard work. And I think that we cannot, as you saw with the shifts, the key shifts, we have to change our way of thinking about being in the classroom. No longer worksheets, they don't work. It doesn't work in math, it doesn't work in ELA either. We have to think deeper, we have to think about how to have our children think beyond the surface of reading a book or, you know, what the chapter said. So it's hard work. And I know some teachers are struggling, but I know also some teachers are inspired by the change. I know just as many teachers probably who are just motivated that this is just a new way of looking at teaching and learning.
As I thought about made the statement at the beginning around the issues of accountability in education, this is where standards and accountability meet. And we do find some struggles because the level of framing, the parameters around what it is students should know and be able to demonstrate is shifting. And because of that, there are some pressures. There are some pressures, but I think you've heard both from Professor Bisk and Ms. Goldstein, the whole idea of how are we supporting teachers to be able to make this transition into the expectations of how we should teach going forward. I saw Councilor Luke's hand.
When I was first on the school committee in the 1980s, we had a program in several schools that I thought was probably the most creative and imaginative way of teaching children. And when I heard the statement that we have to have multiple perspectives on the same topic and creative thinking going on, my memory is whatever happened to team teaching. Where does that fit in this whole new dynamic? Is it possible, or is that a concept that's been thrown out the window and never to come back?
I certainly will start and ask Professor Biss. Collaborative teaching or team teaching is something that's still alive and well and done in many ways. Professor Biss?
Well, first let me say that that's nothing about what's in the Common Core. Because the Common Core doesn't...
That's the goal. Multiple perspectives on the same subject, being able to think creatively, being able to read and understand and look at the author and what inspired them. That all goes beyond the traditional way of being taught literature.
Well, if we're talking about literature, I have to pass this over to her because I don't want to... But, well...
Okay, Counsel, if we can give him a chance to answer the question. Thank you.
Well, in mathematics, I would say the Common Core does not say how you teach or how you run your classroom. On the other hand, I've had a lot of experience team teaching, and I love doing it. So, anybody who's had the opportunity to do it, too often teachers are isolated in their classroom, and opportunities to do that, I think, are wonderful opportunities. But to me, that's a different issue than what's in the Common Core. In some of the discussion here, I'm thinking about the things I want students to know. I want them, by the time they're finished with third grade, to know what 5 times 7 is, quickly. I also want them to know that 5 times 7 represents 5 groups of 7 objects, which is totally different to just memorizing 5 times 7 quickly equals 35. I also want them to know that 8 times 6 is 48, but if they understand that 8 times 6 is 8 groups of 6 objects, and they forget that it's 48, and they know that 4 times 6 is 24, 4 groups of 6 objects doubled is 48. So there's a whole range of strategies that are built on the understandings. Now, the Common Core mentions those understandings. It doesn't address the strategies for doing it. The strategies then are teacher-specific and part of the unpacking process. And I realize I haven't addressed your question, but to me, it's not the right question for this forum in a way. Because if the forum is about what's in the Common Core, and is the Common Core something you want to keep, I want to say, what is the math that's in the Common Core? And I know that if the students that came to my university, and most of the universities that my colleagues teach in across the country, if they knew the math that was in the Common Core, there is so much more we could do with them. And there would be so many more students who'd want to major in science, technology, engineering, math than we currently have now. And to me, that's the issue.
We have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to call Dr. Schaefer first, and then saw the gentleman here in the black sweater. One of the comment that I wanted to follow up is that, again, that aspect of the standards about what you teach, not how you teach. So the idea of team teaching, I think both questions are relevant, but the issue is clearly the standards, Common Core standards, and the Massachusetts frameworks do not dictate how you teach and how you pair teachers and students and others together to deliver instruction and receive instruction. It talks about the what. Dr. Schaefer.
Okay, thank you to the Research Bureau for having this forum. I guess I'm a little bit confused. So about what's in Common Core and then the frameworks, as I understand it, is still the content. So because what I want to know is, these are all, compare and contrast and so on, are more in my way of thinking of, process kinds of things that we need to know. Content, where does that, are we still using the Massachusetts frameworks for content? Or where is that coming from now? Are teachers redoing all that? I'm confused on that.
You've hit on the essence of this discussion, and which is the confusing piece. Because Massachusetts had standards that were identified as the Massachusetts framework since 2001, the revision of those standards in 2011 become the latest version of those frameworks. So the standards, the term framework is the term that's applied to the Massachusetts standard. So to your question as to where the content expectations, they're within the Massachusetts framework. They are still within that Massachusetts framework. The 2011 standards represent the alignment with the Common Core as part of that core content knowledge. And as Ms. Goldstein said, and the additional information that we've added. So we still have Massachusetts frameworks. We heard Ms. Goldstein talk about the 15% additional that were value added for Massachusetts, such as the literature and the pre-K standards, those things that we wanted to have in there. So they're one and the same. They've just been revised to look at current, greater relevancy. Commissioner, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so we still in Massachusetts, we haven't talked about history, we haven't talked about science, technology, engineering, the arts, all of which we have what we use this jargon all the time. We call them standards, we call them curriculum frameworks. You know this stuff. You were part of the state board when this was early, in the early adoption of this work. So those still exist. If you look at the 2010 English language arts standards, you will see are authorless, just like in the previous one. They're still there. They're still Massachusetts authorless. In mathematics, as Professor Brisk said, what we've done is we've made the standards less broad at each grade level. We've looked at what top performing nations in the world in mathematics have done. We've made them less broad at each grade level, more targeted, more focused. We've been more deliberate about the sequence of learning your facts early on, and being fluent in your facts, and in the middle grades being very focused on understanding proportional reasoning, because we now understand in ways that we didn't 10 or 15 years ago, that if you don't understand that conceptually, not just learning the mechanics of it, then your likelihood of being able to take on algebra and beyond is greatly diminished. So we've been much more focused in those math standards.
I always use the analogy with math. How many of us were taught fractions thinking about a pizza? And that a pizza had a certain number of sections and therefore it equaled a whole. And so we all left thinking that whatever number of sections over the number of sections equals 1, and that all fractions equal the whole of 1. That's a common math misconception. Not all fractions will equal 1, correct, Professor Bisk? And so these are the ways in which we've taught ourselves. I learned math that way, but I was always intrigued by what I didn't understand by math. And so I spent more time as an educational leader studying what happens in that whole work of misconceptions in mathematics. The young man here in the black sweater had a question.
Quotes that I read recently was in the Washington Post, and article that's 100, and it was a quote from a teacher, and basically what she said was that educational standards are neither rigorous nor non-rigorous, or more aptly that they can be rigorous or they can be non-rigorous depending entirely on the teacher teaching them. So I guess my question is, why is the discussion of standards an issue, or a big issue, in that so much is still dependent on how it's laid out and how it's taught and how it's implemented?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? I mean, everything boils down to the teaching that a young person experiences day to day in the classroom, and how strong that teaching is and how sharp it is. The notion of standards was to be very transparent about what it is that we expect as students hit certain benchmarks. In Massachusetts, it's at each grade level. Some states used to have standards that were by the end of elementary school, by the end of middle school, by the end of high school. And it's a way of signaling to educators and to parents and students that these are the kinds of expectations that we have of what it means to be up to speed, to be at grade level, to be ready for a high school diploma, to be ready for college level work. This is what it means. These are the kinds of literacy skills that you need. These are the kinds of math skills that we expect. And that way, you'll kind of have a level playing field so that the expectations that your teachers and your school system has for you doesn't depend on which school system you land in, that there's an expectation that Massachusetts has set across the state. And this latest version with the Common Core state standards is the idea that it's not okay for a state to say doing this well in 5th grade math is doing well, when in fact the rest of the world expects this to be what you're doing in 5th grade math. And that's sort of the basic notion behind this. And you know, one of the most compelling pieces for me as your commissioner is that as well as we've done, and we've done tremendously well in Massachusetts, our statewide education system has outperformed every other state in the nation. As well as we've done, for our high school graduates who end up enrolling in our 2- and 4-year campuses, more than a third, about 38% of them, end up being placed in remedial classes where they're not earning credits. They're paying tuition. Taxpayers are paying funding for their tuition, and they're not earning credits because the colleges have said they're not ready for college level work. So we still have a lot of work to do, and part of what I'm hopeful about as we try out the new PARC assessment is that it will do a good job of telling parents, students, and educators how a student is progressing toward being ready for what the world after high school expects, so that fewer and fewer of our graduates end up in a position where they get accepted to college and then told that they're not ready for college level work.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think one of the things that we recognize with the standards, and we talk about what's the role for teachers and how are teachers part of this, the standards have always been informed by groups such as the National Council of Teachers of English and the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. The teacher voice has been strong in the educational and standard arena. It is also hopefully very clear from this discussion today that the transformation that's required by these more rigorous standards doesn't just belong to pre-K-12 education. It also belongs to higher ed, our teacher preparation programs, and that cycle and that loop of how is everyone ready, both as we continue to support teachers who are currently practicing and as we develop teachers who are in pre-service. So I thank you for this. Obviously, there's a lot more interest, and we're out of time, but I certainly thank you for the great questions and discussion.
Thank you for coming. I just want to thank our panelists. It's a great discussion. Please continue to follow along with what the Research Bureau does. We'll continue to follow public education and all the issues that affect municipal government at wrrb.org, or follow us on Facebook or Twitter. Thank you very much, and thanks to Superintendent Commissioner Koszybicki. Thanks, guys.